The year was 1871, and the humid air of the Paraíba Valley in Brazil hung heavy over the endless fields of coffee. The plantation known as Santa Esperança stretched across the hills like a kingdom carved out of sweat and blood. At the center of it stood the great white mansion, the Casa Grande. Its tall windows glowed with candlelight that night, and laughter drifted through the open balconies. Inside, the richest coffee barons of the region were gathered for a grand dinner hosted by the plantation's master, Baron Eduardo Vasconcelos. Eduardo was a tall man with sharp eyes and a smile that rarely reached him. Wealth had made him powerful, but power had made him cruel. Servants moved quietly through the hall, carrying trays of roasted meats, fruits, and wine imported from Europe. Among them was an elderly cook named Mateo. Mateo had worked in the plantation kitchen for nearly 40 years. His hair was white now, and deep lines marked his dark face. But despite his age, his movements were calm and precise. Every dish that left the kitchen carried his signature. Even the Baron himself often bragged to his guests that Mateo was the finest cook in the entire valley. But tonight, something in the air felt different. The heat was suffocating. Even the candles seemed to burn nervously. And deep in the kitchen, Mateo stirred a large silver pot filled with thick, dark soup. The scent was rich and strange, spices, herbs, and something else hidden beneath the surface. Around him, the younger kitchen workers whispered nervously. One of them leaned closer. "Mateo, are you sure about this?" The old cook did not look up. He simply continued stirring the soup. "I have been sure for 40 years," he replied quietly. Back in the dining hall, the Baron slammed his wine glass against the table. "Bring the soup." His guests applauded. It was a highlight of the evening, a rare recipe Mateo had prepared specially for the banquet. Moments later, 2 servants carried in a heavy silver tureen and placed it in front of the Baron. Steam curled into the air, but as Eduardo leaned closer to inhale the aroma, his expression suddenly changed. His eyes narrowed. He sniffed again. Then he slowly turned his head toward the kitchen door. "Bring the cook here." The room went quiet. Moments later, Mateo was led into the hall. The old man stood calmly at the end of the long table, while dozens of wealthy guests watched him with curiosity. The Baron tapped the edge of the bowl with a spoon. "You made this?" "Yes, master." Eduardo leaned back in his chair. "There is something strange about it." A few guests exchanged nervous looks. The Baron's voice hardened. "I think you may have tried to poison me." Gasps spread through the room. Mateo said nothing. He simply looked at the Baron with tired eyes. Eduardo smiled slowly. "Well, there is an easy way to prove your innocence." He lifted a bowl and filled it with the steaming soup. Then he slid it across the table. "Drink it." A servant nearby froze. "Master." "Silence." The Baron slammed his hand on the table. "Drink it," he repeated coldly. The room held its breath. Everyone knew what the Baron expected. If the soup was poisoned, Mateo would die first. And if he refused, the overseer waiting outside would make sure the punishment was far worse. Mateo looked down at the bowl. The soup was still boiling. Steam rose into his face. Slowly, he lifted the bowl with both hands. His fingers trembled slightly from the heat. The Baron leaned forward eagerly. "Go on." Mateo raised the bowl to his lips. Then he drank. The soup burned his mouth and throat, but he did not stop. One swallow, then another, and another. The guests stared in stunned silence as the old cook drained the bowl completely. When he finished, he lowered it slowly onto the table. Not a single drop remained. Mateo wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. Then he looked directly at the Baron. "I hope the taste pleases you, master." The room was silent. For a moment, Eduardo studied him carefully. Then suddenly the Baron burst into laughter. "Excellent." He clapped his hands loudly. "You see? The man is loyal after all." Relieved laughter spread through the room. The tension dissolved like smoke. Eduardo filled his own bowl and began to eat. Soon the rest of the guests followed. Bowls were filled. Spoons clinked against porcelain. Wine flowed again. And the banquet continued. But across the room, one man was not eating. Dr. Antonio Carvalho, the plantation's physician, sat quietly watching Mateo leave the hall. Something about the cook's eyes disturbed him. They were not afraid. They were not angry. They were patient, as if he had already seen how the night would end. 2 hours later, the first scream echoed through the mansion. It came from the far end of the table. A woman dropped her spoon and clutched her throat. Something is wrong. Another guest stood suddenly. His face had gone pale. The walls are moving. The candles flickered violently. Someone knocked over a chair. Then another scream filled the hall. And another. Within seconds, the elegant dinner turned into chaos. One man began laughing hysterically while clawing at his own face. A woman collapsed on the floor, screaming about shadows crawling across the ceiling. And at the center of the madness, Baron Eduardo slowly stood up. His hands were shaking. He stared at the floor as if something terrible was crawling toward him. "No," he whispered. "No, not them." His voice cracked. "They're dead. I buried them." Across the room, Dr. Antonio realized something horrifying. This wasn't poison. This was something else. Something far worse. And somewhere in the darkness of the kitchen, Matteo quietly sat down on a wooden stool. He listened to the screams echo through the mansion. Then he whispered to himself, "The truth takes time to rise." Outside, thunder rolled across the valley, and the nightmare had only just begun. The elegant dining hall of San Esperanca had transformed into a chamber of terror. Only minutes earlier, the room had been filled with laughter, music, and the clinking of wine glasses. Now the air trembled with screams. A wealthy merchant staggered backward, knocking over his chair. "They're coming out of the walls!" he shouted. His fingers clawed at the white plaster, as if trying to push something invisible away. Across the table, a woman collapsed to her knees. Her expensive silk dress dragged across the floor as she sobbed uncontrollably. "Make them stop," she cried. "They're staring at me." Dr. Antonio Carvalho stood frozen beside the table, watching the madness spread like wildfire. He had practiced medicine for 20 years, but he had never seen anything like this. Guests were shaking, sweating, and screaming as if they were trapped inside their worst nightmares. And at the center of the chaos stood Baron Eduardo Vasconcelos. The powerful plantation owner who ruled half the valley with fear now looked like a frightened child. His eyes were wide, his face pale, and he was staring at the floorboards as if they had come alive. "No," he whispered hoarsely. "No, I burned those records." He stumbled backward, nearly falling over a chair. Dr. Antonio rushed toward him. "Baron, you must sit down." But Eduardo grabbed the doctor's arm with surprising strength. "Do you see them?" he gasped. "See who?" "The children." His voice cracked into a terrified scream. "They're crawling out of the ground." Antonio turned to look. There was nothing there, only polished wooden floorboards. But the Baron was shaking violently. His eyes followed invisible figures moving across the room. "They're all here," he whispered. "The ones we sold, the ones we whipped, the ones who died in the fields." His voice dropped to a trembling whisper. "They know." The doctor felt a chill crawl up his spine. Something in the soup had triggered powerful hallucinations. But what kind of substance could cause this? And why would the cook risk such a thing? Another scream echoed from the far side of the hall. A young nobleman had climbed onto the table and was frantically kicking at the air. "Get them off me," he yelled. "They're biting me." 2 servants tried to pull him down, but he fought wildly. Nearby, an elderly plantation owner began laughing hysterically while tears streamed down his face. "I see them, too," he shouted. "They're all here." Dr. Antonio stepped back slowly. This was not ordinary poisoning. Whatever was happening was attacking their minds. The doctor suddenly remembered something he had read years ago during his studies in Rio de Janeiro. A plant, a dangerous one, devil's trumpet. The leaves and seeds could cause terrifying hallucinations if consumed. Victims often saw things drawn from their deepest fears, their darkest memories, and sometimes their guilt. Antonio turned toward the kitchen. If Matteo had used that plant, then this madness was not random. It was deliberate. At that moment, another sound filled the mansion. Heavy footsteps. The door burst open. Jorge, the plantation's overseer, stormed inside with 2 guards behind him. He stopped when he saw the scene. "What in God's name?" His words died in his throat. Guests were screaming. Some were on the floor sobbing. Others were arguing with invisible figures. The overseer's face darkened. "What did you do?" he demanded. Dr. Antonio shook his head. "It's the soup." Jorge grabbed a bowl from the table and sniffed it suspiciously. Then he slammed it down. "Where's the cook?" Meanwhile, Baron Eduardo had collapsed against the wall. He was whispering to someone who wasn't there. "I told him not to sell you. I tried." His voice trembled, but the invisible figures clearly did not believe him. "Stay away from me," he suddenly screamed. He covered his face with both hands. "They were just workers. I had no choice." The doctor realized the hallucinations were forcing them to confront their past actions. Every cruel decision, every violent order, every life destroyed for profit. And their minds were breaking under the weight of it. Outside the mansion, the night air carried the sounds of chaos across the plantation. In the distance, the enslaved workers living in the senzala could hear the screams echoing from the big house. Whispers spread through the dark. Something terrible was happening to the masters. Back inside the kitchen, Mateo sat quietly beside the stove. The old cook's face was calm. He listened to the screams echo through the hallways. One of the younger kitchen workers approached him nervously. "Mateo, what have you done?" The old man slowly folded his hands. "I gave them the truth. But they'll kill you if they find out." Mateo looked toward the window. The distant thunder illuminated the hills for a moment. "They have been killing us for generations," he said softly. "It is time they meet their own ghosts." At that moment, the kitchen door slammed open. Jorge stormed inside with 2 armed guards. His eyes burned with fury. "There you are." Mateo did not stand. He simply looked up at the overseer. "What did you put in that soup?" Silence filled the room. The young kitchen workers backed away nervously. Jorge grabbed Mateo by the collar and lifted him roughly from the stool. "Speak." The old cook met his gaze without fear. "Only herbs." The overseer struck him across the face. Mateo fell to the floor. "You poisoned them." Mateo slowly pushed himself up. "No." He wiped a drop of blood from his lip. "I freed their memories." Jorge's expression twisted with rage. "You think this is a joke?" From the dining hall, another scream echoed through the mansion. A glass shattered. Someone began sobbing hysterically. The overseer grabbed Mateo again. "If the Baron dies tonight, you will beg for death before I am done with you." Mateo studied his face quietly. "The Baron will not die tonight." Jorge narrowed his eyes. "Then what will happen?" The old cook looked toward the dark hallway, where the screams continued, and for the first time, a faint smile appeared on his face. "He will remember." The overseer's grip tightened, but before he could speak again, a servant rushed into the kitchen. "Jorge!" The man was pale and trembling. "You need to come quickly." "What now?" The servant swallowed hard. "The Baron! He's saying something strange." "What?" The servant hesitated. Then he whispered, "He says the plantation doesn't belong to him." The overseer froze, and suddenly the nightmare took a darker turn. The screams inside the mansion of Santa Esperanca had begun to fade, but the silence that followed was even more disturbing. The guests who had once laughed around the dinner table now sat scattered across the hall, trembling, pale, and exhausted. Some stared blankly at the walls. Others whispered to themselves, as if still hearing voices no one else could hear. The hallucinations were fading, but the memories they had uncovered remained. Dr. Antonio Carvalho stood near the doorway, watching the broken figures of the valley's most powerful men and women. He had treated fevers, gunshot wounds, and even epidemics, but he had never seen guilt destroy people like this. At the center of the room sat Baron Eduardo Vasconcelos. The once feared master of the plantation now looked like a man 20 years older. His hands trembled in his lap. His eyes were empty. Overseer Jorge stormed into the hall from the kitchen, his boots echoing across the wooden floor. "Doctor," he barked, "what is happening to him?" Antonio didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at the Baron. Eduardo was whispering something under his breath, over and over again. I didn't know. Jorge grabbed the doctor's arm. "You said it was the soup." "It was," Antonio replied quietly. "Then fix it." The doctor shook his head slowly. The drug is wearing off. Then why is he still like this? Antonio took a deep breath. Because the visions are gone. But the truth they showed him isn't. Jorge's expression hardened. Truth. At that moment, the Baron suddenly stood up. His chair crashed backward onto the floor. Everyone in the hall turned toward him. Eduardo's eyes were wild. They're lying, he shouted. No, they can't be right. He looked around the room desperately. Where's the cook? Jorge's jaw tightened. In the kitchen. Bring him here. Minutes later, Mateo was pushed into the dining hall by 2 guards. The old cook's face was bruised, but his expression remained calm. The Baron stared at him, a mixture of fear and fury. What did you do to me? Eduardo demanded. Mateo said nothing. You put something in that soup. Yes. Gasps spread through the room. Jorge stepped forward angrily. You admit it? Mateo slowly looked around the hall. The guests watched him like frightened animals. I gave you a medicine, the old man said quietly. Medicine? Jorge laughed harshly. You drove them insane. Mateo's voice remained steady. No, I simply helped him remember. The Baron staggered forward. You showed me lies. Mateo's eyes met his. Did I? Eduardo hesitated. For a moment he looked uncertain. Then anger returned to his face. You showed me children buried beneath the coffee fields. The room fell silent. Mateo spoke softly. Because they are there. The guests shifted uncomfortably. Everyone in the valley knew terrible things happen on plantations, but no one ever spoke about them. The Baron's voice rose in panic. You showed me a woman holding a baby. His breathing grew heavy. She said something. Mateo waited. What did she say? He asked quietly. Eduardo's hand began to shake again. She said, the plantation was never mine. The room grew colder. Mateo slowly reached into the pocket of his worn apron. Jorge immediately grabbed his arm. What are you doing? But the cook gently pushed his hand away. From his pocket, he pulled out a small folded piece of paper. Old, yellowed, fragile. What is that? The overseer demanded. Mateo stepped forward and placed the paper on the dining table. It is the truth. Dr. Antonio leaned closer and carefully unfolded the document. His eyes widened immediately. This is the birth record. The Baron froze. What? Antonio read the faded ink aloud. Recorded in the parish of San Miguel 42 years ago. His voice faltered. The room held its breath. Child born to Maria de Conceição. The doctor looked up slowly. She was a field worker. The Baron's face turned pale. Antonio continued reading. The father, listed as Baron Enrique Vasconcelos. The guests gasped. That had been Eduardo's father, the former owner of the plantation. Antonio swallowed hard. The child's name. He looked directly at the Baron. Eduardo. Silence filled the room. Jorge frowned. That proves nothing. But Mateo spoke calmly. Read the rest. Antonio's hands trembled slightly as he continued. The record notes that the Baron's wife gave birth to a stillborn child that same night. His voice dropped. The infant of the field worker was secretly taken and raised as the Baron's heir. The paper slipped from his hands. The room erupted with whispers. No, that can't be. The Baron shook his head violently. You're lying. But Mateo looked at him with sad eyes. Your father needed an heir. Eduardo's legs buckled and he fell into a chair. You're saying? Mateo finished the sentence gently. You are not the son of the Baroness. The guests stared in shock. You are the son of a slave. The words echoed to the hall like thunder. For a long moment, no one moved. The powerful master of San Esperanca was not truly its master. The plantation, the land, the titles, all built on a lie. Jorge finally broke the silence. This changes nothing. He slammed his fist on the table. The Baron still owns this land. But Dr. Antonio slowly shook his head. Legally, it changes everything. He pointed to the document. If this record is real, Eduardo was never the rightful heir. The overseer stared at him in disbelief. You're saying, the plantation belongs to Crown, Antonio said quietly, "Not to him." Outside the mansion, thunder rolled across the valley. Inside, Baron Eduardo stared at the paper like it was a death sentence. All his life, he had ruled with cruelty, believing he was born to power, believing he was superior to the very people who worked his fields. And now he knew the truth. He was one of them. The Baron began to laugh. At first it was quiet, then louder, until it became hysterical. Matteo watched him silently. The old cook finally spoke. "You forced me to drink the soup tonight." Eduardo looked up slowly. "But it was you who swallowed the truth." The Baron's laughter turned into broken sobs. Around them the guests quietly left the hall. No one wanted to stay and witness the fall of an empire. Later that night the gates of Santa Esperanza stood open. Word spread quickly across the valley. The plantation had fallen, and for the first time in generations, the fields would belong to the people who had worked them. As the sun rose over the coffee trees, Matteo stood outside the mansion. Free air filled his lungs. 40 years of patience had led to this moment. Behind him, the house of the master stood silent. The nightmare had ended, because the most powerful poison in the world is the truth.